Part 7. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn. I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 65. Liang Jianfang wavered for a moment, endured the pain and gritted his teeth without speaking. Shen Yu said, "Your substitute will be escorted to the capital by King Yun guards along the same route. Do you know how he is doing now?" Liang Jianfang stared at him closely. He didn't even survive to Yin. He was crushed into meat patties by rocks at Longjingfeng in Huaitang County. The other party used hundreds of dead soldiers. Shen Yu paused and asked, "You said, how anxious is your master to let you die?" Liang Jianfang's eyes were about to burst, and Shen Yu pulled the cloth from his mouth. "No, it's impossible." Liang Jianfang didn't believe it. "You don't believe it?" Shen Yu asked. "Did no one tell you about this when you were imprisoned in the palace?" From Liang Jianfang's expression, Shen Yu understood that someone had told him, but he must not have believed it, thinking that Xie Tingzhou was just trying to deceive him. But now, when the same words are said by different people, the results are different. She can see Liang Jianfang's wavering, but she knows that Liang Jianfang won't believe it now. Shen Yu said, "Do you believe that in less than 3 days, someone will come to take your life?" She took 2 steps back and said faintly, "Of course you won't believe me now. Why don't we make a bet? If you are still alive in 3 days, I will give you a chance to live, provided that I know the truth." After Shen Yu exited, Liang Jianfang thought for a moment and suddenly started banging on the door. "Someone is coming. Someone is coming." The jailer on guard duty was woken up in the middle of the night and came over impatiently. "What are you yelling at in the middle of the night?" "Someone sneaked in," Liang Jianfang said anxiously. "They just chopped me up." The jailer kept guarding the door and saw no one coming in or out at all. Hearing this, he smiled and said, "Where is that person?" "Ran." "Where's the injury?" Liang Jianfang looked at his robe. Legs. He had obviously seen the man slash his leg before, and his leg had been in severe pain for a while, and now it was still burning, but how could there be any wound on his leg? The jailer thought he was talking in his sleep. A man named Liang can't escape the death penalty by pretending to be crazy or acting stupid. Liang Jianfang was most afraid of the word death. The reason why he refused to reveal the person behind it was because the other party promised that he would not die and would at most be exiled. And that person has the final say on how to be exiled. "I'm not pretending to be crazy," Liang Jianfang said. "I saw that man in Shen Zhong'an's army. He seems to be Shen Zhao's bodyguard." The jailer suddenly woke up from his drowsiness and hurriedly ran to the room where Shijie was locked up. Seeing that the people in the prison were still snoring, the jailer checked the lock on the door again. The lock was still in place and no one had touched it at all. Late at night, a tall figure sneaked out of the Dali Temple prison, and after several detours, he arrived at the house of an adult in the East City. On the evening of the second day, Shen Yu came out of Dali Temple. There was a carriage parked at the entrance of Dali Temple, as well as several sedan chairs for adults who came to do business. Shen Yu walked down the steps, and Changliu immediately jumped off the carriage. "Shijie." Shen Yu walked over with a smile. "I'd like to trouble you to pick her up. I can just go back by myself." Changliu smiled and said, "I'm not the one who's bothered." Shen Yu heard the profound meaning, got into the car, opened the curtain and got in. The regulations inside shocked her. She was not that important now. The car looked fine from the outside, but it was too luxurious inside. She opened the curtain again and came out. The inside of the vehicle was covered with a layer of soft white fur. She spent the night in prison yesterday and was afraid of getting the leather dirty. "Why did you come out?" Changliu asked. "Fate is cheap." Shen Yu and Chang Lu sat on the carriage shaft together. "I don't dare to ride in such a good carriage. It feels like you are sending me away." Changliu smiled. "Let's go," Shen Yu said. "There's no hurry," Changliu said, His Highness hasn't come out yet. Shen Yu was surprised. Your Highness is here too. She thought Xie Zhou was just casually warning the people at Dali Temple, but she didn't expect that he actually came to pick her up. Isn't that right? Changliu raised his hand and pointed. When I came here, I met the master of the Metropolitan Procuratorate and invited him in for a cup of tea. Dali Temple is next to the Dutch Yuan. Xie Zhou has arrived in Beijing for the first time. He and Li Jifeng have different identities. If he wants to survive here safely, he must not just be a straw bag. Even if an adult expresses goodwill to him, he still can't throw someone off his face directly, and he still has to close any strings he has with him. Xie Zhou sat for a while in the Metropolitan Procuratorate. After a cup of tea, he stood up and left. His Royal Highness is leaving in such a hurry. Deputy Censor Wan Ruxian stood up to see him off. Wan Ruxian was once sent from Shengjing to the local area to supervise the censor. At that time, he offended a corrupt official. The corrupt official jumped over the wall and colluded with the bandits to kidnap Wan Ruxian. The place was near Balin. Later, the king of Balin came forward. Save people. Later, Wan Ruxian prospered all the way to the officialdom, and now he sits in the position of left deputy censor of the capital. There is also some Balin's work here. Xie Zhou looked outside and said, "It's getting late, so I'll pick up the people and leave." Wan Ruxian went out together all the way. I would like to see who needs the prince to pick him up in person. It's just a child in the family, Xie Zhou said with a smile. It's a joke. He's half grown, so he has to worry more about it. Adults. After stepping out of the entrance of the Metropolitan Procuratorate, Wan Ruxian stopped seeing him off and stood at the door watching from a distance. Before Xie Zhou could get closer, the carriage was approaching, and a young man with a handsome face jumped out of the carriage and stood in front of him. This jail sentence was not in vain, Shen Yu said with a smile. The two looked at each other, and Xie Zhou understood her words and said, "Let's talk when we get back." Shen Yu nodded, "But I know the answer. Prison food is terrible." Wan Ruxian didn't know what the young man said to Xie Zhou, but when he saw Xie Zhou's face from a distance, his face remained normal, and the ice and snow in his eyes suddenly melted a little. The two of them got on the carriage one after another and got into the carriage. The young boy on the carriage smiled and raised his whip, and the carriage drove towards Guanghua Gate. Shengjing is divided into an inner city and an outer city. The imperial palace and official offices belong to the inner city, while the mansions, streets, and alleys belong to the outer city. In front of Guanghua Gate, a chamberlain blocked the carriage's way. "Excuse me, is the prince in the car?" Changliu reined in the reins and said, "That's right." "Is something wrong, father-in-law?" "Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince author, Gigi." Chapter 66. The chamberlain walked a few steps and faced the carriageway. "Your Majesty, the younger one is here to deliver the order. The emperor heard that the crown prince is here. It's so late, so he specially ordered the servant to come and invite the crown prince to come to the palace for dinner." Xie Zhou opened the car curtain and saw that the person who came was the godson of the chief of ceremonies, De Fu, and since it was in full view of everyone, his words should not be false. He turned to Shen Yu and said, "You and Changliu go back first." Shen Yu asked, "What about you?" "Changliu will send you back and pick me up again. He knows how to arrange it." Shen Yu felt sorry for having to torment Changliu to run back and forth. "Why don't I go back by myself and let Changliu follow you?" Xie Zhou glanced at her. "Wang Fu, do you have the final say or do I?" Shen Yu curled her lips and turned her head away from him. Xie Zhou got off the carriage and stood beside the carriage to explain to Changliu. Zhang Lianzi just came out of the household department and happened to see the chamberlain stopping Xie Zhou's carriage at Guanghua Gate. He was not familiar with Xie Zhou, so he just waved to say hello when he passed by. The car curtain opened a little further, and Shen Yu asked Xieting Zhou in a low voice, "If His Highness comes back late, will I still wait for you?" "It won't be too late," Xieting Zhou said, "wait for me at Qingpu residence. Shen Yu discovered something last night and will discuss it with him today. Others can't hear the joint here at all." These words made the waiter think of something, and he lowered his head and did not dare to take a look. The car curtain was lowered, and Changliu drove away. Zhang Lianzi frowned at the carriage and suddenly said, "Your Highness, may I ask who is in the carriage?" Xieting Zhou said concisely, "My people." After saying that, he raised his feet and left. The chamberlain covered his mouth and smiled, and said to Zhang Lianzi in a low voice, "Master Zhang, please don't ask so clearly. Some things are difficult to explain openly." The chamberlain followed Xieting Zhou away. Gao Jin, who was behind him, whispered, "Recently there are rumors in Beijing that Xieting Zhou is a seductress. He found a young man in Ziwiun Tower. There is also a favored young man beside him. It is probably—" "Don't talk nonsense without basis," Zhang Lianzi shouted to stop. Gao Jin lowered his head and said, "Yes, sir." The carriage drove farther and farther out of Guanghua Gate and onto Yongning Street. Zhang Lianzi looked at the direction in which the carriage disappeared and was a little distracted. Just now he saw half of a side face from under the raised curtain, which was similar to Au, but what he heard was the voice of a young man. Xieting Zhou really left early and came back early, before 2 o'clock. When he entered the hospital and didn't see Shizhi, he asked, "Where are the others?" Zifeng knew who he was asking, "Still eating." "Why so late?" 11 Feng was speechless. Shi Yu thought he was unlucky in prison, so he asked Chang Lu to look for a brazier. Chang Lu also went crazy on his own, stepping over the brazier and looking for mugwort leaves to smoke. The two of them tossed around in the yard for a long time. Yixun was so moved that she came to me to complain. Xieting Zhou didn't mean to punish after hearing this, but instead curled up a slight smile on his lips. Nagario is not yet 16 this year, and Shizhi is 17, which is the right age to play. "Let them make trouble," Xieting Zhou said, "let Shizhi come over later." Shen Yu came over after dinner. Xieting Zhou had finished washing and was waiting in the study. Shen Yu walked into the study and thought of the Black Panther that night again. "Is Kang your highness's pet?" "No," Xieting Zhou said. "Then how did you tame it?" "Not tame." Xieting Zhou thought for a while and said, "That autumn, I hunted a black panther. Later I found out that it was a female leopard that had just given birth, and Kang was her cub. There was another one that I couldn't feed or tame, but it was just a cub. It's just that I was raised since childhood." "So you ask me if Kang is my pet?" "No, it should be said that I am its enemy." Shen Yu was silent. "Let's get down to business. Has His Highness chased that person?" This was a plan that the two of them had discussed in advance. Liang Jianfang is imprisoned in Dali Temple prison. The person behind him has two options. One is to continue to find ways to silence Liang Jianfang before he spits him out. The other is that if Liang Jianfang is tight-lipped enough, he can continue to use him to bite him. Other people. It was obvious that both Liang Jianfang and that person chose the second path. "Xieting Zhou, no. No," Shen Yu raised her voice, "I took such a big risk and you didn't catch up with me." Xieting Zhou raised his eyes to look at her. "I haven't finished speaking yet, and I didn't catch up with him, but I found him entering Lu Cheng's mansion." Shen Yu rolled her eyes at him. "Didn't this mean the same thing? This is what they want. That person could not only suppress the food and grass at Yan Liangwan, but also create all kinds of difficulties on their way back to Beijing. He must be a person with great hands and eyes. Therefore, it is impossible for Dali Temple to be without his informants." Last night Shen Yu visited Liang Jianfang at night. Liang Jianfang must have started to waver. Even if he didn't waver, the person behind him wouldn't completely believe it. In addition, Dali Temple has already asked Qiyu for questioning, and these people are afraid that they will be unable to sit still, because they have no idea how much Qiyu knows and how much Liang Jianfang has told him. Will Lu Cheng send someone to silence him? Shen Yu asked. Xie Tingzhou held his head. I always feel that this matter won't be that simple. I think so too, Shen Yu said seriously, but first we have to catch someone out. Xie Tingzhou said, if Lu Cheng doesn't kill Liang Jianfang within 3 days, what are you going to do? Then I'll trouble you, Shen Yu said, then would you mind lending me 2 secret guards? Just scare Liang Jianfang. Xie Tingzhou lazily said, what if I don't borrow it? Then the worst I can do is go in person. Xie Tingzhou pursed his lips and said after a moment, I have made arrangements for the prison in Dali Temple. Shen Yu pretended to be flattering and said, Your Highness is really powerful. There are actually people from His Highness even in Dali Temple. Xie Tingzhou, I have something even more powerful. What? Shen Yu asked reflexively. Xie Tingzhou stared at her face for a moment, then suddenly turned away and said unnaturally. Dali Temple has been organized. The problem now is that you have to go to the Dali Temple prison in 3 days. Then you will go in disguised as a jailer. Since Shen Yu said those words that night, Liang Jianfang can't sleep well now. He is frightened all day long. If there is the slightest noise in the middle of the night, he thinks someone is coming to kill him. He used to eat the food as soon as it came, but now he was worried that someone would poison the food. Whenever the meal arrived, he would not eat it first, but would put some in the corner, waiting for the mouse to eat and find it safe before he started eating. The first 2 days passed, and in the early morning of the 3rd day, Liang Jianfang woke up and saw a dead rat lying next to the bowl that the jailer had forgotten to collect last night, and the leftover rice in the bowl from last night was missing. Liang Jianfang was horrified. It seemed that the young man had really predicted that the master really wanted to kill him. It seems that the other party saw that he was very cautious when eating every day, so he put the poison on the bottom layer of the food. Fortunately, he had a bad appetite last night, so he used less, otherwise he would be the one lying on the ground now. Liang Jianfang felt that he couldn't wait any longer. He didn't eat all day on the 3rd day and didn't even dare to drink. He was eagerly looking forward to the arrival of night. The man said that as long as he told the truth, he would save his life. Now that the adults have abandoned his abandoned child, there is only one way left for him to go. Liang Jianfang gritted his teeth. Since you are treating me unkindly, don't blame me for being unjust. If you want me to die, even if I die, I will drag you to hell. As the sun sets, the Dali Temple prison gradually disappears into the night. Liang Jianfang didn't dare to sleep. He sat in the corner and leaned against the wall, staring in the direction of the cell door. The footsteps gradually came closer and stopped in front of the prison. The young man's voice sounded, the 3rd day is coming, have you thought about it? You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, Reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 67. Liang Jianfang looked and saw the person at the door fiddled with the lock on the cell door and stepped into the cell. Shen Yu was wearing the clothes of a jailer today, and Liang Jian almost didn't recognize her. When he saw who it was, he hurriedly jumped off the bed. Think about it, since seeing the dead mouse in the morning, Liang Jianfang didn't dare to eat or sleep that day, and finally waited for someone. Shen Yu lowered her eyes and stared at him. Tell me. It's a long story, Liang Jianfang rolled his eyes. May I ask if this little brother can help me save my life? A cunning person like Liang Jianfang must get his life-saving charm before speaking. Do you still have a choice now? Shen Yu sneered, you are already dead on that road. Can you survive today or tomorrow? Believe me, you still have a chance to survive. Liang Jianfang was defeated by him, but he also knew that his words were true. After thinking for a moment, he said, "This matter starts with the invasion of the Western Jew people. In September last year, the Western Jew invaded. As a civil servant, Liang Jianfang was assigned by Emperor Tongxue to supervise the army. He was a temporary dispatcher and was placed in the army to supervise the generals who went on expeditions. The superiors gave him a death order, and Shen Hongan and Shen Zhao could only leave without returning, no matter what method he used. So you stole the military defense map to the Zihu people? In order to kill them, you actually collaborated with the enemy." Shen Yu gritted her teeth to control herself from cutting the person in front of her. Liang Jianfang was shocked by the hatred in his eyes and said hurriedly, "I didn't steal the picture. How could I be the only chess piece in such a big matter? There must be other people in the army." Shen Yu was doubtful. "Since you didn't steal it, how can you guarantee that you will lose this battle, and how can you complete the mission? You don't know something." Liang Jianfang walked to the door and looked around, then whispered, "Because of the food and grass. Forage. Liang Jianfang, the food and grass will never arrive." Shen Yu was horrified. "You mean, you knew before you left Beijing that there would be no food for this battle?" Liang Jianfang nodded. Several events quickly connected in Shen Yu's mind. Shen Hongan received news that the food and grass were already on the way. Later, the food and grass were delayed, and subsequent news said that it was coming soon. This was obviously delaying time and preventing them from finding ways to raise food and grass from other ways. If he had known about it earlier, it would have been too late to make emergency transfers from other state capitals. However, from the beginning, there was no such thing as food and grass. Shen Yu calmed down and continued to ask, "The food and grass are coordinated by the Ministry of Household Affairs and then dispatched from the granaries in various places. How can he guarantee that the food and grass will not arrive?" "I don't know about that," Liang Jianfang said, "I'm not responsible for that link." "Shen Yu, keep talking." Liang Jianfang shrank in fright. "Later, you also knew later, I hid in the city, and then Shen Hongan got a batch of grain and grass from somewhere. If the grain and grass entered the city, then this battle would be unwinnable. Let's go." A death order was issued in the former capital. "Either Shen Hongan dies or I die. I can only order the city gate to be closed." Shen Yu couldn't bear it anymore. She pulled out the knife and put it on Liang Jianfang's neck. "That's 100,000 people. That's my dad, that's my brother." Her hands were shaking, and Liang Jianfang could already feel the stinging pain on his neck. He leaned back in horror and stammered, I am still useful, don't kill me." Shen Yu held the knife tightly, slowly took it back, took out something from her waist and threw it in front of Liang Jianfang. Write down everything you just said." Liang Jianfang looked at the paper and pen on the ground, put his hand on the ground and shrank back. He knew that once he wrote it down and had a confession, he would have no meaning in existence. "Don't worry," Shen Yu said coldly, "I want you to identify him personally, but if you don't write it, I can kill you now." Liang Jianfang picked up the pen and paper, licked the pen, and started writing with shaking hands. "Write the words well," Shen Yu warned. "The Guanghua gate is closed at night and no one can go in or out. The inner city will not open until the quarter of the yin hour. At the Mao hour, it is the time for the various ministries to change their duties." Shen Yu took her waist card and walked out of Guanghua gate with another jailer and past Yongning Street. The two looked at each other and parted ways. She stood there without leaving. She obviously knew some details and who was behind the scenes, but she felt even sadder in her heart. Because she suddenly realized that even if she knew everything, even if she caught the murderer, her father and brother would never come back. The scene of that day appeared in front of her eyes. The weather was so cold and the snow was so thick. She rummaged through the piles of corpses, praying in her heart before opening each corpse that it must not be them. But she was ultimately disappointed. A carriage stopped in front of her. 11 Feng looked at Shijie, who was bowing his head, and said nothing, but opened the curtain. Xieting Zhou lowered his eyes and said softly, "Come up, we're going back." Shen Yu got on the carriage and leaned against the window in a daze. Xieting Zhou glanced at her silently, but did not speak. Instead, he stayed aside quietly, leaving her some room for silence. After a moment, Shen Yu took out 2 pieces of paper from her sleeve and handed them to him. Xieting Zhou took it, Liang Jianfang's confession. Shen Yu nodded lightly. Xieting Zhou glanced at 10 lines. After reading it, his eyebrows tightened and his hand holding the confession was trembling slightly. Such a ridiculous thing is simply unheard of. Xieting Zhou folded the paper and raised his voice, "Zai Feng, go to the Metropolitan Procuratorate." Xieting Zhou lives in the 3rd rank and needs to attend court every day. But he was the Prince of Balan, and Emperor Tongxue gave him an official position just for show, so he was exempted from going to court every day. The door of Fengtian Palace opened wide, and the prince and ministers lined up on both sides. Since Xieting Zhou entered the palace, he attracted everyone's surprised looks. This was the first time they had seen him come to court in so many days. Suddenly there was an uproar in the palace. Wan Ruxian, the imperial censor of the left capital of the Metropolitan Procuratorate, stepped into the hall wearing a scarlet robe. The Prime Minister of the Metropolitan Procuratorate has the responsibility of picketing according to the Constitution. Even a small supervisory censor can impeach a first-class official regardless of his rank. The addition of Fei Pao is the beginning, which means that Wan Ruxian will impeach an official today. When the time came, Emperor Tongxue entered the palace and immediately saw the crimson color among the people. Emperor Tongxue looked solemn. "Wan Qing, who do you want to impeach today?" Wan Ruxian submitted the memorial and solemnly said, "Your Majesty, the Yan Liangwen case will be tried by the 3 law divisions." Wan Ruxian, the left deputy censor, today reported the Yan Liangwen case to impeach Ji Liangji, the Minister of Household Affairs, for colluding with the treacherous minister, framing Zhongliang and causing the defeat of Yan Liangpas. There was an uproar in the palace. Emperor Tongxue quickly read the memorial and already knew it in his mind, and said in a deep voice, "Memory." Yes, Wan Ruxian took a step forward. Last September, treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, Reborn, I refused to marry the scumbag and marry the prince author, Gigi. Chapter 68. When Xieting Zhou walked out of the hall, he felt that the court and the great Zhou were already rotten. He stood there and didn't leave because he didn't know how to explain to her. This was the result of running around. Shen Yu didn't sleep all night. Zai Feng kept urging her to go back and wait, but she didn't listen and kept waiting outside Yongning Street. The court officials dispersed one after another, and it took a long time before Xieting Zhou appeared at Guanghua Gate. Xieting Zhou had always kept his face quiet, but Shen Yu could tell from his expression that things were not going well today. Xieting Zhou approached. "Why didn't you go back?" "Don't worry," Shen Yu said. Xieting Zhou nodded. "Let's get in the car and talk. I will hand over Liang Jianfang's confession to Wan Ruxian, who will come forward to impeach Ji Liangji, the Secretary of the Ministry of Household Affairs, for colluding with Liang Jianfang and causing the defeat." Shen Yu looked at Xieting Zhou's face and asked, "Did something go wrong?" Xieting Zhou looked at her and said after a while, "Liang Jianfang is dead." "What?" Shen Yu was shocked. Xieting Zhou said coldly, "After hearing the impeachment, Emperor Tongxue prepared to interrogate Liang Jianfang on the spot. Those who went to arrest people will report that Liang Jianfang committed suicide in prison out of fear of crime." "This is nonsense," Shen Yu said angrily. "Liang Jianfang was so afraid of death. Who would believe that he committed suicide out of fear of crime?" "Some people believe it," Xieting Zhou frowned lightly. "The most important thing is that before he died, he left another confession letter, which is completely different from the content of the one you handed me. Shen Yu's brain exploded with a bang, and she said urgently, someone forced him to write a confession, and then killed him and pretended to commit suicide out of fear of crime. Xieting Zhou said, the two testimonies came from the same person, but they were completely opposite. Emperor Tongxue was so worried that he could only detain the two groups of people together for further examination. There are two testimonies from the same person, and neither one of them can be justified. It seems that the confession can no longer be used as evidence, and we have to find another way out. She left the Dali Temple prison, and someone went to kill Liangji Unfang. It seemed that someone in the Dali Temple was keeping an eye on her, and maybe her movements were also noticed. Shen Yu pondered for a moment, then suddenly said, I want to go to Lu's clothing store. Seeing Xieting Zhou staring at her, Shen Yu asked, what do you think I'm doing? Nothing. Xieting Zhou looked away. Shen Yu tilted her head and looked at him. There seems to be something wrong with this prince recently. When he was on the road before, he would argue with her no matter what, but he seems to be much calmer recently. The carriage stopped in front of a clothing store. Before Shen Yu got off the carriage, she turned back and said, Your Highness and Zifeng should go back first. I will go back to the palace by myself. Xieting Zhou didn't get out of the car and watched Shen Yu enter the store. Zifeng leaned back, tilted his head slightly and said, now that he doesn't avoid his highness, I think he is starting to gain trust. Xieting Zhou lifted a bit of the curtain with his index finger, and through the crack he saw the shopkeeper welcoming Xiu into the inner room. Shen Yu asked, is there any news about green medicine? The shopkeeper shook his head heavily, walked to the table and opened the drawer, but there is a letter from Hes Hu, which was just delivered this morning. Shen Yu nodded, opened the letter, read it and asked, is there any news from Shen's house? This. The shopkeeper hesitated. Say it. Yes, the shopkeeper said, I personally sent the letter. I reminded the second lady by the way, she said. The shopkeeper said cautiously, she said that the eldest daughter of the Shen family has died in Yanliang Pass. Where did Xiao Xiao dare to pretend to be the eldest daughter of Shen? Could it be that she wanted to defraud money? After Shen Yu finished reading, the hand holding the letter dropped on her lap. Do you want to send another one now? The shopkeeper asked tentatively. No need, Shen Yu said, I will go find her myself. After walking out of the store, Xieting Zhou and 11 Feng had not left yet, and parked the carriage to one side so as not to block the customers entering the store. Shen Yu got on the carriage. She was a smart person and would not ask embarrassing questions. You can't ask him why you haven't left yet, and then wait for him to say I'll wait for you. The horse-drawn carriage drove along the noisy streets. Shen Yu remembered Hung Qiao's letter, so she asked Xieting Zhou, that batch of grain and grass, it was said that the grain transport officer died on the road, and that batch of grain and grass was missing. Xieting Zhou said it is said that the food and grass were robbed by bandits in Kikame Mansion. In the past few years, the situation in Dazhu has become increasingly bad. Corrupt officials are rampant and the people are in dire straits. Some farmers have worked hard to farm for a year, but after paying the public grain, they still don't have enough to eat. There are more and more victims of the disaster, and many of those who have no food to eat have simply turned into bandits, hoping to find a way to survive. This has also led to the proliferation of bandits in the Great Zhou dynasty. Which bandit dares to rob the food and grass on the front line? Shen Yu snorted coldly. So I said it was rumored, Xieting Zhou said slowly, now the imperial court is short of people, and even a single person who suppresses bandits has not been able to come up with a regulation. Can't we let the vassal kings from all over the country suppress bandits? Xieting Zhou shook his head, Emperor Tongxue is suspicious by nature. Does he dare to let the vassal king lead his troops to leave the country? That's true. When it comes to candidates, there is one readily available. Xieting Zhou only dared to take 2,000 Qingyun guards with him when escorting him, and he turned around and returned to Bailin 50 miles away from the capital, just for fear of being dragged by Emperor Tongxu's pigtails. Shen Yu thought about it, and suddenly an idea came to her mind. Qi Chang, Qi Chang. What's wrong? Xieting Zhou asked. Shen Yu suddenly grabbed his hand and said excitedly, the location of Qicane Mansion. Why was the food and grass lost in Qicane? Xieting Zhou said nothing, staring blankly at the hand holding his. My heart seemed to be lightly touched by something. Why do her hands look so small? How could such a small hand wield such a long knife? He looked at him for so long that Shen Yu instantly noticed something strange and quickly retracted her hand and said, Your Highness, I'm offended. Seeing the hand retracted, Xieting Zhou felt a hint of disappointment in his heart. It doesn't matter. 11 Feng suddenly heard an offensive sentence outside the car, but he didn't know how Shizhi offended his highness. What did you just say? Xieting Zhou concentrated. Shen Yu said, if I remember correctly, the location of Qicane Mansion is very special. Xieting Zhou thought for a while and nodded. Qicane Mansion is adjacent to the two vassals, and the official road on the other side leads directly to Shengjing. Yes, Shen Yu was a little excited. In a place like this, if things are lost, it will be difficult for the three parties to send troops, so they have not been able to draw up a charter. From which state is the food and grass dispatched? Why was it lost in Qicane Mansion? Woolen cloth. Xieting Zhou was silent for a moment. I have to ask the Ministry of Finance. Shen Yu thought of Zhang Lianzi. This case must be closely related to the Ministry of Household Affairs. So, was Zhang Lianzi, the Minister of the Ministry of Household Affairs, involved in it? Looking at her thoughtful expression, Xieting Zhou asked, what are you thinking about? I'm thinking about Zhang Lianzi, Shen Yu replied subconsciously. Xieting Zhou raised his eyes to look at her, straightened his lips and turned his head away. Shen Yu could now barely feel some of Xieting Zhou's temperament. It seemed that he was unhappy, but she couldn't figure out why he was unhappy. After thinking about it, it was probably because of Zhang Lianzi's sentence. Could it be that they are political enemies? What I mean is, Shen Yu thought for a moment and said, he is the Minister of Household Affairs. I am wondering if this matter has anything to do with him. No need to explain to me, Xieting Zhou said calmly, then leaned against the car wall and closed his eyes to fall asleep. Shen Yu looked at his silent face. Why did she suddenly feel that he was having trouble? Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince author, Zhiji. Chapter 71. Shen Yu sat high up, facing the door, looking directly at Shen Yan. She looked at Shen Yan coldly, and saw only shock and fear in her eyes, but not any joy. Shen Yan doesn't want her to come back. This was obviously the answer she had expected, but it still made people feel chilly. They are all members of the Shen family, but they are separated from each other, or in other words, they have never been of the same mind. Under Shen Yu's gaze, Shen Yan involuntarily clenched her fingers and tried to keep her voice steady. Zaqui, go down. No need, Shen Yu pointed her chin towards the ear room. Two maids in the wing knelt there tremblingly, not daring to say a word. The maid Zaqui walked over and knelt down side by side. Shen Yan took a breath, lifted up her skirt, knelt down with a plop, and spoke with choked sobs, sister. Shen Yu stared at her intently, as if she wanted to take another look at the sister she had not been able to see through before. After a long while, she said, I thought that I, the eldest sister, would no longer be able to enter the Shen family. Sister is blaming me, Shen Yan said. Why should I blame you? Shen Yan choked and said, shopkeeper Lu sent me a letter, but I didn't go to see you. Shen Yu sneered, so you still know that I'm still alive. When shopkeeper Lu sent the letter for the first time, I thought it was someone impersonating me, so I didn't believe it. Shen Yan paused and continued, I reluctantly believed it the second time, but I didn't dare to come see the eldest sister. That's nonsense, Shen Yu said coldly. I clearly explained the reason in Lu Yao's letter to you. Shen Yan raised her head in shock. What are you talking about, elder sister? Liu Yao never gave me any letters. I have never seen her since she left Beijing with you. Shen Yu's heart skipped a beat. Could it be that the green pill disappeared before the letter was delivered? Or is it that Shen Yan's deception skills have reached the level of perfection? She looked at Shen Yan's face carefully, and there was no hint of lying from her expression. Shen Yan continued, I received the news that my father and brother were killed in the battle at home, and I couldn't find any results after asking around for the whereabouts of my eldest sister, so you decided to mourn me without permission. Shen Yu interrupted her. From now on, there will be no more Shen Yu in this world, and you, Shen Yan, will be the only lady left in the Shen family. How could the eldest sister miss me so much? Shen Yan walked a few steps and said with tears, the eldest sister has gone to the border and there is no news. Even her father and brother are gone. You will definitely not live alone. You mean to let me die? Shen Yu's eyes were sharp. Shen Yan was startled and immediately explained, that's not what I meant. If there is no funeral, how can I explain to others why you did not attend the funeral of my father and brother? How will others speculate? Besides, I was in Beijing for the tragic situation at Yanliang Pass. I also heard that so many people died, and I never thought that the eldest sister could come back alive. I was just thinking that even if the eldest sister had to leave, I still wanted to leave a good name for the eldest sister. Shen Yu sneered in her heart, so, you are doing it for me. Shen Yan said, honestly speaking, if the eldest sister really doesn't come back alive, wouldn't this be the best way to deal with it? Shen Yu leaned over and stared coldly at Shen Yan on the ground. This is indeed the best outcome for you, but it's a pity that I'm back. How can a charming young lady raised in a boudoir be compared with an ironclad warrior killed on the battlefield? There was an evil aura about her body, and the moment she leaned down, it seemed that people could smell the blood on the battlefield. It was the first time that Shen Yan was intimidated by such an aura. It was the first time that she discovered that Shen Yu, who had seemed gentle in the past, actually had such an overbearing aura. Shen Yan wanted to get up, but felt that her entire back was tense and she couldn't move at all. Sister, you really blamed me wrongly, Shen Yan cried, I'm not yet 16 years old. Yes, Shen Yu said disappointedly, I also want to know how you, only 16 years old, got such deep scheming. In her last life, she was trapped in the Zhang mansion, and Shen Yan hadn't left the cabinet yet. She would come to see her every 10 days and talk to her. For this reason, she was grateful at the time, so later her stepmother asked her to help Shen Yan find a good husband, and she was very dedicated in doing so. Now it seems that isn't it profitable for Shen Yan to frequently go to Zhang mansion? At that time, the Shen family had collapsed, and the Zhang family was still at its peak. If Shen Yan didn't cling to the Zhang family, who could she cling to? It's funny that Shen Yu went through life and death before she learned to see people with their heart. Shen Yan raised her breath and wanted to say something, but she lowered her voice and said, eldest sister, if you want to misunderstand me, just misunderstand me. A Yan can't defend herself. Shen Yan, Shen Yu said with disappointment in her tone, don't show this attitude in front of me. I don't want to do this, and I don't have the time to act out a show of sisterly love with you here. Shen Yan bit her lower lip when she said it. Since Shen Yu didn't believe it no matter how she explained it, then why did she bother to make gestures here? They are all the legitimate ladies of Shen Mansion, why should she kneel to Shen Yu here? It's better to break up and pretend she's tired. Shen Yan was silent for a moment, then suddenly smiled, her body tilted and she knelt softly on the ground. She raised her head and looked at Shen Yu, why are you so smart? Sometimes I wonder why when everyone mentions you, they always say Miss Shen, but when they mention me, they can only refer to Miss Shen Er. Obviously I am also a general. My legitimate daughter. Is the title important? Shen Yu asked. Important, Shen Yan stared at her hatefully. If your name is not right, your words will not be right. You have been loved by your father and brother since you were a child, how can you understand how I feel? My father is an upright official. How much salary and rewards can he get? My mother has the title of general's wife, but her life in the general's mansion is not as good as that of a wealthy businessman's concubine. And what about you? Shen Yu said, that's because my grandmother loves me. Yes, Shen Yan cried and laughed at the same time, every time I get the gift you gave me, I comfort myself like this. How wonderful would it be if you didn't have such a grandmother? Then I wouldn't do it again. Seeing our differences again. Shen Yu shook her head in disappointment, you always blame others, why don't you find the reason from yourself? I found it, Shen Yan shouted, so I found that the opportunity has come. As long as I let you Shen Yu die at the border, everything here will be mine. There will be no more Shen Yu in this world. Everyone mentioned Miss Shen family, I only know it's me, Shen Yan. Shen Yu stood up, and Shen Yan immediately backed up in fear, what do you want to do? The maid on the side finally couldn't bear it anymore and crawled over on her knees to block Shen Yan, but was kicked away by Shen Yu. Shen Yu lowered her eyes and looked at her, let me ask you, where is the green medicine? Shen Yan stiffened her neck and said, I have already told you that I have never seen her before. If you don't believe it, you are familiar with the general's mansion. You can search here as you like. Shen Yu had already searched and found no one. Her girl also denied seeing the green medicine. She walked closer to Shen Yan step by step, trying to break through her psychological defense. When she reached the door, Shen Yu stopped and said, don't think. Her voice paused suddenly, and her eyes fell on a floor tile on the right side of the door. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, Reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince author, Gigi. Chapter 72. The floor tiles were the same as the other floor tiles in the courtyard, nothing special. If I had to tell the difference, it would be that the color of that brick is newer than the other bricks. A terrible thought passed through Shen Yu's mind. She lowered her eyes and stared at Shen Yan and asked, why did you change the brick at your door? Shen Yan's expression suddenly froze, you have to worry about changing a brick. Her expression confirmed Shen Yu's suspicion. She knelt down, and with lightning speed, she caught Shen Yan's neck, let me ask you again, where is the green medicine? Shen Yan was choked so hard that she couldn't breathe, so she squeezed her hand hard, no. I don't know. Several maids rushed over and were kicked to the ground by Shen Yu. Don't call people. Seeing the maid preparing to go out and call people, Shen Yan said with difficulty. Shen Yu knocked her to the ground, have you ever seen my yard? The brick at the door is full of patterns. Lu Yao likes to sit on the ground at the door and draw pictures when he has nothing to do. Don't tell me, your maid has it too. Such a hobby. Lu Yao must have come to find Shen Yan and handed her the letter, but Shen Yan still insisted on sending her condolences. What about green medicine? Where is the green medicine today? Will. Shen Yu didn't dare to continue thinking. Green medicine knows kung fu, and the maid next to Shen Yan must be no match for her. She may have drugged her while she was letting her guard down. You want money or status? I don't care about these things. I can give them to you, but you shouldn't plot against me or touch my people. I'll give you a deadline. I want to see Lu Yao within 3 days. This is the last chance I give you, just because you are still my father's bloodline left in this world. If I still can't see you in 3 days, you will know what kind of person I am then. The footsteps gradually faded away. Shen Yan suddenly got up from the ground and staggered out to chase her. "Aren't you afraid that I will expose you?" "Okay." Shen Yu stopped and looked back. "Don't forget that you mourned for me without authorization. You also had a share in deceiving the king. You just killed the 9 tribes. Aren't you, Shen Yan, among the 9 tribes? We just happened to go down together to pay homage to my father. Please forgive me." Shen Yan's face instantly turned pale. Now they are holding each other's back. She shouldn't be afraid of Shen Yu, but Shen Yan knows that she can't fight her. When Shen Yu came out of Shen Mansion, there was no bright moon in the sky, and a thin drizzle was falling. She looked back and saw that the lantern on the door was swaying in the cold night wind, and even the figures of people were blurred by the rain curtain. This place can no longer be called home. She sighed, turned around and walked back slowly. But for a moment, a black shadow flashed across the eaves, and disappeared into the darkness in the blink of an eye. Lu Mingxian is right next to the east gate of the palace, and you only have to walk for a moment after entering. Suddenly there was a barking from the end of the trail. Woof! Shen Yu raised her eyes and saw a dog running towards her excitedly from the door of Lu Mingxian. "Dawang!" Shen Yu happily ran 2 steps, squatted down and let Dawang pounce on her. Rhubarb rubbed against her legs, and his tail almost broke. "Why are you here?" Shen Yu rubbed Dawang's head and heard him bark twice. There was another person standing at the door. She raised her eyes to look at Xietingzhou. The two looked at each other and understood the meaning in each other's eyes. Shen Yu lowered her head, hugged Dawang tightly, and confirmed again in disbelief, "Grandpa, he." "Come into the house," Xietingzhou said. It was already getting late, and Arya was sitting on the porch dozing off. When she saw the two of them coming in, she rubbed her eyes and got up to bring tea and water. Shen Yu lowered her head, as if she had been saying goodbye to different people since her rebirth. "First my father, my brother, then my grandpa." She didn't know if this was a punishment. Why should the only warmth be ignored by her? Dawang felt her depression and lay on the ground close to her legs. Xietingzhou stood at the door. She was stronger than he thought. He thought she would shed tears. "My father-in-law left those huts to you so that you can have a place to stay when you have nowhere to go." Shen Yu raised her head and asked, "Is it painful for him to leave?" When Xietingzhou looked at her expectantly, he lied, "It's not painful." Shen Yu nodded. Even if it was comfort, she needed it very much at the moment. Xietingzhou pursed his lips, his eyes fell on the back of the hand on her lap, and he frowned slightly. "What's wrong with the hand?" Only then did Shen Yu see several blood marks on the backs of both hands, which must have been from her grabbing Shen Yan's neck. "The dog scratched me," she said. Dawang raised his head and barked. "It's not you," she touched Rhubarb, "it's a mad dog. I thought she was as docile as you." Xietingzhou heard what she meant and asked, "Where's the medicine?" "What medicine?" Shen Yu asked. Xietingzhou looked at her quietly, "Jinchuang Yao." "Oh," Shen Yu said, "I've used it up. I wonder if the doctor still has it." Xietingzhou was speechless. "You have used up such a big bottle of medicine?" Shen Yu nodded. "Yes, there are a lot of wounds on my back." "Of course you don't know if you haven't seen them." Xietingzhou turned away his face. "Why hasn't he seen it?" "I can't see clearly anymore. Now, as long as I close my eyes, I can still recall the scene at that time." Xietingzhou turned his head and called out the door. A secret guard jumped down from the roof and landed silently. The secret guard came and went without a trace. After a moment, he presented a bottle of golden medicine and disappeared again. Xietingzhou raised his hand and threw the medicine to her. Shen Yu took it and took a look. "It's not like last time." The medicine was worth thousands of gold, and he didn't feel sorry for the money. The most important thing was that it came from the hands of the miracle doctor Master Songshi. The medicinal materials were hard to find, and there were only a few bottles in the world. You are not that valuable, Xieting Zhou said. Shen Yu made a sound, called Arya to bring some water and cleaned her hands before wiping them on the back of her hands. The medicine was applied in a mess. Xieting Zhou couldn't bear to look at it for a while, so he stepped forward and took the medicine away from her hand. The two of them had drugged each other on the road for quite some time and were already used to it. Coincidentally, both of them were injured on their arms along the way. If the injury was elsewhere, they could have taken care of it themselves. Xieting Zhou's fingers are as slender as green bamboos, with slightly raised joints. Such hands are pleasing to the eye no matter what they do. Shen Yu stared at his hand for a moment, then moved her gaze upwards and landed on Xieting Zhou's face. This face is pure and pure, like a person in the sky, with mountains and rivers as eyebrows and stars and moon as eyes. When it is smiling, it is charming, and when it is cold, it is heartbreaking. Shen Yu's heart suddenly beat abnormally, her fingers curled up, and she was inexplicably lost in thought for a while looking at his face. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince author, Gigi. Chapter 73. Lu Mingxuan's lights went out, but Xieting Zhou did not leave. After a moment, he lightly climbed onto the roof. A soft sob could be heard in the room. I thought she was getting stronger, but in fact she was just leaving her wounds to lick. Xieting Zhou lightly lifted his clothes and sat gently on the roof, looking at the endless night in a daze. Shen Yu was on duty the next day. When she woke up in the morning, her eyes were as swollen as walnuts. After hearing Arya's instructions, she rolled them in eggs for a long time before they were slightly relieved. The weather has been getting warmer these days, and the snowfall a few days ago must have been the last of this winter. Shen Yu stood under the eaves and reviewed the ins and outs of the case again. The Secretary of the Ministry of Revenue, Ji Liangji, did not run away when he got involved in this case, so Zhang Lianzi secretly contacted Xieting Zhou for two reasons. Either he discovered the problem and wanted Xieting Zhou to rescue him out of good intentions, or he knew some signs and wanted to use this to bring down Ji Liangji. But there is a huge flaw here. Since he knew there was a problem, why didn't he report it directly to the Holy One, instead of using such a roundabout way? Zhang Mansion, in the study room of Chief Assistant Zhang Yuanqing. Grandfather and grandson both looked solemn. Zhang Yuanqing said, Ji Liangji is inseparable from the Yan Liangwen case. Now it depends on how your majesty decides. If Yan Liangwen is defeated, someone will have to bear the blame. Zhang Lianzi understood clearly. Just like in the previous life, Emperor Tongxue couldn't find a reasonable reason to explain to the people even though he knew it was not their problem, so he could only let the rumors go. In the end, Shen Zhong'an and Shen Zhao were charged with this crime. Zhang Yuanqing was silent for a moment and continued, as soon as Ji Liangji is dismissed, the Ministry of Finance will inevitably use an official to support the affairs. As the Minister of the Ministry of Finance, you are the first choice, but... He paused, lowered his head and took a sip of tea, and continued, at this age, he is the first person to take the position of Minister of Household Affairs since the beginning of the Zhou dynasty. It is not a good thing to be promoted too early. What do you think? Zhang Lianzi was silent for a moment and replied, Lianzi has no intention of promotion. Zhang Yuanqing nodded, stroking his long beard and said, that's it, I'll put this matter down for now, but you should temporarily take over the position of Minister of Household Affairs as Minister of Household Affairs. If Zhang Lianzi was smart enough, he would avoid the edge and not take the position of minister at this time, Shen Yu said while playing chess. Xieting Zhou glanced at her and heard her continue, his qualifications are still a bit shallow after all. He just became the Minister of Household Affairs. Crack dash. Xieting Zhou threw the piece in his hand back into the chess set. Shen Yu was interrupted, raised her head and asked, this has just begun, will your highness stop now? Xieting Zhou pointed his chin towards the chessboard, is there any more left to play? Shen Yu stared at the chessboard for a long time, frowned and said, why did it end so quickly? This is not my level. I can usually last at least half an hour. Xieting Zhou glanced at her, do you have enough brains? Just dare to think about other things while playing chess. Chang Liu sat on a tree branch and laughed, but Shen Yu gave him a sharp look. Shen Yu returned the chess pieces to their positions and refused to admit defeat. Let's play another game. The next round will have the same result, Chang Liu said with a smile. Brother Feng, how about we make a bet? Zifeng felt chills all over his body when he shouted Brother Feng. Xian glanced at him and said, aren't you disgusting? Let's make a bet. Chang Liu jumped down from the tree and hooked his arm around Zifeng's neck. I bet that your highness will win, and you bet that Shizhi will win, how about that? You are really good at picking, Zifeng sneered, why don't you bet on Shizhi to win? Shen Yu looked on from the side, I'm sitting here, who are you insulting? Chang Liu laughed, sorry, that's better than this. Let's bet on how long Shizhi can last in his highness' hands. I'll bet for half an hour. Shen Yu held her chin up and asked, can I participate? No. I'm afraid you'll cheat. Chang Liu refused sternly and said to Zifeng, the bet is, if you have it, I'll bet 2 months' salary. 11 Feng said, if I win, I can only win 1 month's salary of mine. If you win, you can win 4 months of your salary. Is it fair? Chang Liu counted on his fingers and suddenly said, Your Highness, why are there so many more Zifeng people than me? Because you eat a lot, Shen Yu answered with a smile. Xieting Zhou picked the chess pieces leisurely, with a smile on his lips. Chang Liu snorted, clasped his hands and bowed to Xieting Zhou, Your Highness, whether we win or not depends on you. Zifeng thought for a while and said, then I'll bet for an hour. Another chess game started, and the two of them were going back and forth. In less than half an hour, Shen Yu showed signs of fatigue after making a move. Xieting Zhou twirled a piece of money between his fingertips and looked at her. Her eyebrows were knotted, and she was about to make a move but pulled it back, feeling that it was wrong to go anywhere. Don't delay, Chang Liu reminded. Shen Yu glanced at Chang Liu and finally missed it. Xieting Zhou reached out his hand without thinking. Wait a minute, Shen Yu stopped Xieting Zhou, who was about to make a move. I made the wrong move, this and this don't count. During those days when they were together day and night, she had developed her face, and discovered that whether it was the legendary god of death on the battlefield or the later gentle and jade-like young master Lan Yu, they were not the real Xieting Zhou. At least in her opinion, Xieting Zhou has an excellent temper. It's just that, except for sometimes being uncertain, I get angry for no reason. It just so happened that she was born to like to climb along the pole and like to test the bottom line of others. After discovering that Xieting Zhou had a hard time getting angry, she became bolder. She moved her head to another position under Xieting Zhou's silent gaze, and then looked at Xieting Zhou calmly, It's your turn, Your Highness. As long as I am shameless, I will be invincible and I will win this game. No one has ever seen anyone dare to regret his move in front of Xieting Zhou. Kono under the eaves. Just wait to die, Shizhi. Everyone was waiting to see how their crown prince would twist off Shizhi's head. 11 Feng took 2 steps forward, thinking that he might as well try to persuade him. Shizhi Senzuki escorted his highness to the capital, and when he came back, he was whipped again. He looked like he had lost weight, no, gained a lot of weight. Oh, right. Why have you gained weight? Zifeng was thinking about it and forgot to stop the fight, when he saw Xieting Zhou holding a sunspot and asked calmly, You won't change this time. 11 Feng's jaw suddenly dropped. The guard on the tree shook a little and almost fell down from it. No, this is still their highness. Could it be that someone switched the package on the way back to Beijing? What is this but silent acquiescence? Do you indulge him like this? It was okay that Xieting Zhou didn't ask, but Shen Yu wasn't sure about this question. She stared at the chessboard seriously for a long time, but couldn't find the problem. I won't change it anymore, she said. Xie whose eyes never left her face, and he slowly pressed the bag in his hand. He was satisfied to see her stretch her neck and frown her eyebrows. He twitched the corners of his lips slightly and said, "There is no chance to change it. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince author, Gigi." Chapter 74. Shen Yu raised her eyes to look at him. The chess piece in her hand was almost crushed by her, and finally she threw it directly on the chessboard. No more playing. The smile on Xie whose face finally spread, like a warm spring breeze. He patiently picked up the last few fallen moves from the chessboard, and pointed at a spot with his long fingers. "Did you see it?" Shen Yu nodded. "I made a mistake here." Xie opened his hand and held a few white seeds in his hand. This was to give her a chance to continue from where she was just now. "How could this be possible?" Changliu roared. "Uh-huh." Before the second half of the sentence was uttered, Zifeng covered his mouth and dragged him to the corridor, his eyes beckoning him to watch. Changliu took a closer look and saw that His Highness's face was rarely gentle and relaxed, and he looked a bit indulgent. After it was over, Changliu complained in a low voice, "Your Highness is so reckless, I will lose this game." More than that, Zifeng stood aside with his sword in hand and said calmly, "We can't win." Shen Yu suppressed the raised corners of her mouth with difficulty and grabbed Bai Zi from Xie whose palm. The fingertips lightly traced across the palm, and the tingling feeling spread to the entire arm. Xie whose eyes flashed slightly, his gaze swept across his palm, and he slowly clenched it into a fist and placed it on the table. Suddenly there was a noise outside the hospital. Xie said without raising his head, "Go and have a look." 11 Feng lifted his feet and walked away. A moment later, Li Jifeng arrived before anyone else arrived. "I had a bad stomach a few days ago, and you didn't even bother to come and see me. It's so chilling." Shen Yu glanced back, and Xie knocked on the table to remind her, "Concentrate." "Shen Yu, oh." Li Jifeng snorted, "This prince came to see you. I just didn't want to greet you." He didn't even have a chair. As soon as Shen Yu knew that he was the prince, she wanted to stand up and salute. As soon as she made the move, she heard Xie say without raising her head, "Just sit down." He added, "He ranks 9th. Shen Yu nodded and said, "I've met His Highness 9th Prince." "No gifts, no gifts." Li Jifeng waved his hand casually, turned around and asked, "Which master is this?" The implication behind his words could make Xie act like this. If he wasn't a master, why would he need Xie to be so serious? Changliu covered his mouth and smiled, "It's our master Shizhi." When Li Jifeng heard this, he immediately became energetic and walked around Xie to stare at Shi Yu. Speaking of which, Li Jifeng had seen Shizhi before, but the light in the prison was too dark at that time, so he couldn't see clearly enough. Now that he saw it, he really had red lips, white teeth, white eyebrows, and clear eyes. If he changed into women's clothes, the room would be quite interesting. Thinking of this, Li Jifeng quickly shook his head and put aside these messy thoughts and sat down on the chair brought by the maid. "Li Jifeng, stop the boat. Watch the chess without saying a word," Xie reminded. Li Jifeng closed his mouth in discomfort. He was not good at such elegant things and found them extremely boring, so he crossed his legs and called the maid to serve tea, eating and watching. This was so unbelievable that his eyes almost fell out. Usually, watching people play chess was just a back and forth affair, but now watching Xie play chess really overturned his previous stereotype of chess. Can this game of chess be played like flirting? When Xie drops a piece, he feels something is wrong and picks it back secretly, or when he drops the piece, he gently hooks his little finger and steals Xie piece back. But Xie clearly saw it, but he seemed to be blind, letting Shi Yu do whatever he wanted. Li Jifeng turned his head to look at Chang Liu dumbfounded, and asked silently, "What is going on?" Chang Liu nodded heavily and responded silently, "It's always been like this." Li Jifeng couldn't help but look at Shi Yu a few more times. It was really not easy for this person to smooth a stone like Xieting Zhou. While he was looking at it intently, something cold suddenly hit his eyelids. "Ah!" Li Jifeng screamed in pain and quickly covered his eyes. When he lowered his head, he saw a sunspot. Xieting Zhou didn't even have time to retract his hand. "Xie Yun, what did you do? Will you compensate me for being blind?" Xieting Zhou raised his chin and pointed at Shen Yu, saying, "Let her give it, she has money." Shen Yu said in surprise, "I didn't hit him, why should I give it to him?" Xieting Zhou's eyes seemed to have deep meaning, "Don't you like to rob the rich and give to the poor?" Shen Yu heard his sarcasm. It was that time on the road when Shen Yu said that she robbed the rich and gave to the poor. This man actually took it to heart. "You are not poor," she whispered. The more Li Jifeng watched, the more he felt that the way the two got along was unusual. One was silently conniving, the other was at ease. I couldn't help but secretly sigh that Xieting Zhou would still be here today. In the afternoon, Shen Yu and the guard went out after changing shifts. Today happened to be the third day after Shen Yu went to the Shen mansion. She had to find Shen Yan to ask for someone. There was a man standing at the base of the wall outside the east gate, rubbing his hands in a very anxious manner. The person who came was a clerk from a clothing store. When he saw Shen Yu, he came up to her. Shen Yu gave him a look, and the two of them walked around the street. The waiter then said, "I've been waiting for a long time." The shopkeeper said he has something important to ask you. "What's up?" "This morning the servant from Shen Mansion came to deliver a letter. It's probably related to the whereabouts of the green medicine," Shen Yu thought to herself, so she and her assistant hurried to the clothing store. As soon as he reached the door of an inn, a young man in rich clothes rushed over from the other end of the long street on horseback. The horse ran rampant all the way, and pedestrians on the road gave way. The horse still knocked over several stalls and pedestrians. The man was still shouting, "Get out of my way." Shen Yu frowned and was about to step forward when she was grabbed by the clerk from the clothing store. The waiter lowered his voice and said, "This is Dou Qing, the son of the Dou family. He is a well-known overlord. There are people above him. If you are young, you should say nothing. Master, it is better not to interfere." Seeing Dou Qing running closer and closer, he was about to hit a child in the middle of the road who was unable to avoid him. Shen Yu immediately moved forward, and when she was facing the horse, she took off the saber from her waist and slashed at him. The horse's hoof was stumbled hard, and its front hoof buckled and it fell to the ground. Dou Qing was immediately thrown out. After rolling on the ground for a week, he got up and wiped his face. Blood was already flowing from the scratched area on his face. Dou Qing roared, "Who the hell are you? How dare you block my way?" Shen Yu helped the frightened child and turned to look at Dou Qing. "It's not to block the road, it's just to save people." The child's mother hurried forward and took the child from Shen Yu's hands. She did not dare to offend the overlord and hurriedly hid among the crowd of onlookers. Dou Qing glanced at the horse that was kneeling on the ground, flicked his riding whip and said, "I don't care what you did, blocked my way, cut off my horse, injured my horse, you can't see me tomorrow's Sunday." Shen Yu sneered, as if she heard some joke, turned around and left. Dou Qing became angry and swung the whip, but Shen Yu grabbed the tail of the whip with her backhand, wrapped it around her wrist twice and pulled hard. Dou Qing didn't expect the seemingly thin young man to have such strength. He was almost dragged down by him and quickly let go. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Treating the Concubine, Eliminating the Wife, Reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince author, Gigi. Chapter 75. Shen Yu took the riding whip and threw it on the ground. At this moment, the servants who had been left behind by Do Qing also followed up. It turned out that there were as many as 10 people, surrounding Shen Yu. Across the door from the inn is a rather large restaurant in Shengjing. The street was noisy at this moment, and the elegant room on the second floor of the restaurant facing the street had its windows set up. A young man stretched his neck and looked down for a moment, then turned around and said, "It's that idiot Do who is causing trouble in the street again, doing whatever he wants with the power of his cousin." The man in the room took a sip of tea and said, "Let him make trouble. The bigger the trouble, the better. The Zhang family has gone too smoothly over the years and cannot be used by me, so the more trouble the better." The young master lay on the window and stared for a moment, then rubbed his eyes and suddenly said, "Huh? Why does the person Do Biao bully look familiar to me?" Downstairs, Do Qingkong pointed at Shen Yu, gritted his teeth and said, "Kneel down for me now, cut off one of your arms, and I will spare your life." Shen Yu stood on the steps in front of the inn, looked at Do Qing condescendingly, and said calmly, "Unfortunately, I am very rare about this arm, and I want to keep it for myself. Why don't you come up with another solution?" Do Qing was stunned at first, and after looking her up and down, he felt that this young man had red lips, white teeth, and a pair of bright peach blossom eyes. This was the first time he saw such a good-looking man, except of course, his cousin. Coupled with the arrogant look in his eyes, Do Qing's throat tightened. Do Qing said with a smile, "How about this? How about you come with me and go to my Do mansion to discuss how to solve it?" The waiter gently tugged on Shen Yu's sleeve and said very softly, "This Do Qing doesn't care about men and women." How could Shen Yu not understand the frivolous look and teasing tone in Do Qing's eyes when he looked at her? If it hadn't been for the public, she would have chopped him up long ago. Shen Yu said, "The horse's leg I patted was only slightly injured. I will compensate you for the horse's injury. As for your injury, I also paid for the medicine. Let's forget about it." If she wasn't afraid of making things worse, she would never have made such a concession. She shouldn't have taken action in the first place, but it was absolutely impossible for her to do nothing. Do Qing tilted his head, suddenly turned around, pulled out a knife from a servant, and slashed the horse's neck. Blood spurted out, and the horse fell to the ground and twitched a few times, then stopped moving. Do Qing turned his head, raised his chin and looked at the person in front of him provocatively, "Now that the horse is dead, I am not short of money. See if you will take the initiative to come back with me, or if I will tie you back." Facing Do Qingdu's provocation, Shen Yu clenched her teeth. Anyone who has been on the battlefield knows that horses are friends of warriors and will not behead horses unless absolutely necessary, but Do Qing beheaded his horse in such a grand manner. Ever since Do Qing swung his sword to kill the horse, the smile on Shen Yu's face disappeared. She lowered her eyes slightly, her faint gaze passing over the knife in her hand, and a murderous intent flashed in her eyes. Seeing this, the servants quickly gathered around him and her, drawing swords at each other. The crowd of onlookers, fearing that they would be accidentally injured, all moved back far away, leaving an open space in the middle of the street. "Go to Shuntian Mansion and call someone for me," Do Qing said to the family. Do Qing struck the ground with a knife and raised his head. "Do you know who I am, young master? My cousin is a high official in the court. When he stamps his foot, the whole Zhou dynasty shakes. I see you are not an ordinary person, but you are just unlucky and fell into my hands today. I will give you another chance and follow me. I will forget about it." Shen Yu sneered. "Shengjing is the capital, and a falling brick can hit 3 capital officials. I'm afraid there will be no other idiot besides Do Qing who dares to say at the emperor's feet that one of his relatives would make Shengjing shake 3 times if he stomps his feet. I wonder if his cousin, a high-ranking official, would want to wipe Do Qing's neck directly after hearing such words." Shen Yu smiled and said, "Then do you know who I am?" Doqing looked around carefully. There were many young men in Kyoto. Judging from the momentum of this young man, he seemed to have a background. "Then who are you?" "Shen Yu, I am your father." As soon as she said this, everyone was stunned, and many people in the crowd laughed out loud. Doqing was so angry that his eyes were about to burst. "Damn you, you are so shameless. My cousin is a third-rank official in the Ministry of Household Affairs. I want him to ransack your home, kill your 9 tribes, and then imprison you as a plaything." Shen Yu's heart skipped a beat as she was a third-rank official in the Ministry of Revenue. It couldn't be such a coincidence, right? Shen Yu frowned, "But that Minister Zhang from the Ministry of Revenue." Doqing said proudly, "That's right, you're afraid." Seeing Shen Yu's expression change instantly, Doqing couldn't help but feel proud. "If you're afraid, just follow me." Shen Yu pursed her lips. She was indeed unlucky enough, and now her mind came to her senses. She looked at Doqing carefully and remembered. She has actually met Doqing and has some connections with him, but she has never met him in this life. Doqing, also known as Do Mingda, is Zhang Lianzi's cousin. In the past, she always heard people call him Mingda. Moreover, when she saw Doqing, Doqing was much fatter than he is now, so she never recognized him. Now she took a closer look at Doqing. On his face, you can vaguely see the shadow of the fat man. Doqing is a playboy who is idle and has no real job. He spends his days doing nothing but flirting with women, eating, drinking, whoring and gambling. Doqing had a lot of troubles in his previous life, but Zhang Lianzi's mother was soft-hearted. Every time she cried, she would go to Zhang Lianzi, cry, make trouble, and hang herself, asking Zhang Lianzi to clean up the mess for him. In his previous life, when Doqing went to Zhang Mansion, he encountered him touching a maid in the mansion in the garden. Shen Yu stepped forward to stop her, but he said back that she had seduced him and that the maid was not a good person. Maybe she wanted to refuse, but she even wanted to welcome him, so she kept falsely accusing Shen Yu of having a tryst with Doqing in the garden and she bumped into her. Fortunately, Zhang Lianzi knew who Doqing was and didn't believe him. However, her mother-in-law said that flies would not bite seamless eggs and punished her by copying the commandments for women 10 times. Enemies are really on a narrow road. Thinking of this, Shen Yu felt a fire in her heart. If we had a head-on confrontation with Doqing now, it would probably make things worse. If Zhang Lianzi came forward then, it would probably not end well. Doqing is a money-loving person, so it seems that the only way to avoid disaster is to give up money. "If your horse is injured, I will pay you 500 taels of silver," Shen Yu said. Doqing was stunned for a moment, then sneered, "Do you think I am short of money? 1,000? 2,000? 5,000? There was a buzzing discussion among the crowd. This was really a huge sum of money, enough for ordinary people to live a life without worries about food and clothing. But Shen Yu came from the Lu family in Hezhu, and no one in the whole Zhou dynasty dared to say that they were richer than the Lu family. To her, this money was just a drop in the bucket. He took her money to see if Doqing had the flower of life, and if he turned back too many times, he would spit it out. Shen Yu, 10,000. Doqing was also dumbfounded. Although he was born into a noble family and had been well clothed and well fed since childhood, he had never seen 10,000 taels of silver. 10,000 taels is more than enough to buy a dozen beautiful concubines. Although this beautiful young man cannot be obtained, it is okay to take the money first and then play dirty tricks. But judging from the attitude of this young man, the price should still go up. 50,000 taels. Doqing straightened his neck and opened his mouth. Shen Yu snorted coldly, "Why don't you go and grab it?" The young master upstairs saw this and finally confirmed it. He touched his palm and said, "Hey, I have actually seen him. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, Reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince author, Gigi. Chapter 76. 50,000 seemed to be too much. Doqing thought for a while and said, I won't mess with you. I'll give you 20,000 taels and forget about it. Suddenly, a calm voice came from the wind. It's really a big deal. When Shen Yu heard this voice, she was suddenly shocked. Didn't he enter the palace today? Why are you here? The crowd dispersed to make way for the officers and soldiers to clear the way, and a carriage slowly drove to the door. The appearance of the carriage looks very ordinary. He should not be a high official, but at most a 5th or 6th grade official. Doqing didn't take it seriously at all and glanced at him contemptuously. Who are you? 11 Feng on the carriage seemed not to hear it and got out of the carriage and opened the curtain. Xietingzhou, who was in the carriage, was wearing a green shirt and his face was a little pale. He leaned against the wall of the carriage and looked at Shen Yu with a faint coolness in his eyes. Shen Yu hesitated for a long time and then whispered, Your Highness. Doqing was startled and stammered, Which, Your Highness? There were more than a dozen princes in the capital, and Doqing had never seen most of them, so he couldn't guarantee that he would meet any of them. Xietingzhou glanced sideways and said, Tie him up. Shen Yu was shocked. The next moment, they saw Doqing's hands being cut behind his back and tied behind his back. Hey, brother, you tied up the wrong person. Oh, it hurts, it hurts, it hurts. Doqing howled, as if he was killing a pig. Xietingzhou raised his hand and pressed his eyebrows, Shut your mouth. As soon as the officer went through the operation, Doqing's whining was soon the only thing left. Xietingzhou had already entered the palace, but he felt unwell during the banquet, so he had to go back to the palace first. On the way, he happened to meet the officer of Shuntian Mansion who received a report that someone was causing trouble and came to deal with it. This is the only way Xietingzhou must pass when he returns home. Unexpectedly, the person causing trouble is Shizhi. The Yamen servant had already seen clearly that this man was acquainted with Prince Balin. A Yamen servant walked up to Shen Yu and said, Please come back to the Yamen with us and explain this matter clearly. Shen Yu felt Xietingzhou's needle-like gaze on her, and slowly stretched out her hands to tie them up with the officer. Excuse me, officer brother. Xietingzhou's eyes were dark and cold, he pursed his lips and said, Get in the car. Shen Yu hesitated. Want me to pay for it? His voice became colder and colder. After thanking Tingzhou, he turned his head and coughed twice. Xietingzhou looked very pale today. Shen Yu was afraid that he would be angry to death, so she quickly climbed into the carriage and sat at the door, not daring to look at Xietingzhou. The car curtains were lowered, and the light suddenly dimmed a bit. The space inside the car was very large, with a small table in the middle and a small heater under the table letting out hot air. The wind blew and the carriage rocked slightly. It was so quiet inside the car that Shen Yu had no choice but to lift a corner of the curtains and pretend to look out the window. Tens of thousands of taels of silver came out of nowhere. Where did you go to rob the rich and give to the poor? Xietingzhou asked. Shen Yu lowered the curtain and sat up straight, saying calmly, You know how the money comes from. What I heard was a soft hum from Xietingzhou, who sounded unhappy, and he didn't know who had offended him again. Xietingzhou didn't speak, just looked at her indifferently, and asked after a moment, I heard that you are Zhang Lianzi's uncle. Shen Yu looked at Xietingzhou with a puzzled look on her face. What? Xietingzhou said, Doqing's father is Zhang Lianzi's uncle. If you want to be his father, wouldn't he be Zhang Lianzi's uncle? Shen Yu, if I were his father, I would piss him off sooner or later. Xietingzhou didn't smile at all. Why did you change your attitude as soon as you heard that his cousin was Zhang Lianzi? Shen Yu didn't expect that he would come so early and even listen to this part. She turned around in her mind and said, his cousin is a third-grade official. I am an ordinary citizen. Naturally, the people will not fight with the officials. Xieting Zhou narrowed his eyes slightly, his face was solemn, and his lips pursed into a straight line. She was really bold, daring to make nonsense in front of him. She was sure that he wouldn't expose her directly, right? Shen Yu met his heavy gaze and knew that Xieting Zhou didn't believe her words at all. Suddenly an idea flashed and she said with a smile. His Highness has a sharp eye and is very perceptive. Nothing can escape His Highness's eyes. The flattery skills have gone to another level, Xieting Zhou said, talk like a human being. Yes, Shen Yu sat upright and said, I wonder if His Highness still remembers the time when we were in the woodshed of the inn. In fact, I am not pretending to have broken sleeves at all. I am really broken sleeves. Your Highness, the most beautiful person in the world, will not obey me. So I can only settle for the next best thing. I heard that Mr. Zhang is not bad, so I want to leave a good impression on him. In addition to the increase in flattery skills, the bullshit skills have become even more proficient. A girl told him that she had a broken sleeve. Where to cut off? What to use to break it? Xieting Zhou's face was livid and he was so angry that she had a headache. He closed his eyes, pressed his eyebrows and said, get out of here. Great Shen Yu opened the curtain and found that she had arrived at the capital's yamen. Since it's involved, it still has to go to court. When Shen Yu and Xieting Zhou arrived in the hall, Dou Qing had already let people loosen their bonds. He even looked at the seats and sat with his legs crossed on the side of the hall drinking tea. There was a thin old man with grey hair in the hall. His official uniform was washed white, and he looked like an upright official. However, he was untying Dou Qing and looking at tea with him alone. The water was probably a bit muddy. Lu Fu saw Xieting Zhou in the hall and hurriedly came down to greet him. He bowed to Xieting Zhou and said, I pay my respects to the prince. Please sit down. Xieting Zhou declined politely, Master Lu is just interrogating, this prince is just a spectator. After saying that, he looked at Dou Qing, who quickly put down his tea and stood up. Just now I heard Dou Qing call him the eldest son. Apart from Xieting Zhou, who else could find another eldest son who was born in Beijing and looked like this? I was afraid that today was going to be over, so I quickly winked at the boy standing at the door and asked him to hurry up and bring in reinforcements. Lu Fu walked back to the hall and sat down. He was stunned and asked, who is there in the hall? Shen Yu raised her eyes and glanced at Xieting Zhou, cupped her hands and said, greetings to your lord, Kayaman Shiu. Dou Qing met Xieting Zhou's cold gaze and said hurriedly, my surname is Dou Ming Qing. One has no drumming, and the other has no complaint. One is the cousin of the minister, and the other seems to be an acquaintance of the prince. Neither of them was easy to mess with, so Lu Fu did not follow the usual procedure and asked directly, what do you two mean? Dou Qing immediately reprimanded, young master, I was walking on the street. He rushed up and hacked my horse to death. Not only did I get hurt, but he also drew his sword at me. Sir, such an arrogant person must not grow.